Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all can hear me. I'm going to call on my colleague Craig Eiting at the Water Center just to flag people who are coming into the waiting room. We've still got some people coming in, so thanks for everyone for being right on time. Welcome. It's 3:32. It's February 3rd, 2021. Our last edition of the spring seminar series was on April 22nd, 2020, and a lot has changed since then. And in some ways, a lot has stayed the same. We're here on our couches and in our basements on Zoom doing these webinars. And I'm really excited to start a new series, one that we started planning back in the late summer last year. So this has actually been a pretty long time coming, and really looking forward to today's talk with Professor Anthony Schutz at the Law College, and all the talks. We have 7 total for this series, which I should remind everybody is entitled Tributaries, Race, Justice, and the Environment. That is the theme and the focus for this spring seminar series. For folks who are new to the series, perhaps if you'd like to get a little more information about the Water Center and the series, head over to our website. It's user-friendly. Craig does a great job of updating that with content and information. It's watercenter.unl.edu. And while I'm at it, I'm going to send a quick note to everybody in the chat. So I'm Jesse Starita, Public Relations and Engagement Coordinator. I think we will just jump into the seminar. And I'm really excited to let some people know that Professor Schutz has pre-recorded this talk. I've watched most of it already. It's a great talk. And then he will be on the line to join us for Q&A around 4:15. So please do stay tuned, because he'll be here and you can ask him a question directly. And we also are recording this seminar, so if you have to duck out a little bit early, don't feel bad. You can catch it on YouTube at a time of your choosing. All right, with that said, I'm going to have a friend and colleague of mine, Ken Winston, give an introduction to our first speaker in the 2021 series. And technology willing, this will go smoothly.
Hi, my name is Ken Winston. I'm an attorney and environmental policy advocate, and I've been working in that arena for most of the past 20 years. And I'm honored today to do the introduction for Professor Anthony Schutz. Professor Anthony Schutz graduated from the University of Nebraska College of Law in 2003 and has been teaching there since 2006. He's taught courses in agricultural law, environmental law, water law, land use regulation, state and local government law, and contracts. He's currently serving as the Associate Dean for Faculty. He's also the faculty advisor for the Agricultural and Environmental Law Society, Moot Court, Nebraska Connections, and also leads the Rural Law Opportunities Program. The product of a farm family in Elmwood, Nebraska, Professor Schutz's research interests include the often intertwined subjects of agricultural law, environmental and natural resources law, and state and local government, all of which have significant impacts on rural landscapes and populations. Professor Schutz is a frequent lecturer on agricultural and water law issues, regionally and nationally. He tries to keep a close eye on the legislature and encourages students to speak up and take part in the legislative process. Professor Schutz's keen understanding of the issues involved and the implications of policy decisions has helped shape the outcome of several environmental and agricultural policy decisions that have been considered by the legislature and other decision makers in recent years. I've personally reached out to Anthony Schutz on a number of occasions when I've had questions about agricultural or environmental policy issues, particularly when they relate to matters that are pending before the legislature. He's always provided incisive input about these issues, and I believe that other folks find him to be a valuable resource in this area as well. Environmental justice is one of the most important issues of 2021. This requires consideration of factors such as the disproportionately negative impacts of resource allocation and pollution on minority and low-income communities. I look forward to hearing Professor Schutz's presentation connecting disparate racial outcomes to environmental law and environmental and agricultural laws and practices.
Hi. So this series is set up to get you thinking about race and justice as they relate to natural resources. I'm going to basically work through 6 pieces of this discussion, and I've got those highlighted here in this short slide just to sort of keep us on track. I'm going to talk first about my personal and professional background, and then sort of link agriculture and natural resources use, and then talk about race as it relates to agriculture, and specifically with regard to agricultural resource distribution, and then agricultural environmental impacts, which is really sort of an environmental justice piece of the puzzle, and then talk a little bit about race, responsibility in agriculture more generally, and then sort of talk at the end about ways forward. So that's the plan for this little discussion, hopefully about 40 minutes, and then I'll get on the line and we can do a little bit of a Q&A. I believe I've been introduced at this point by Ken Winston. Hopefully he didn't say anything bad about me, but in any event, thanks Ken, and thanks to the Water Center for having me do this little talk. So personal and professional background. I think this is important really whenever you're trying to listen to somebody. You have to sort of understand, I think, where they're coming from. And I think that's an important aspect of what it is that we're trying to do with this series and with our efforts more generally to foster diversity and inclusion and those sorts of things. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of my background. I grew up on a farm south of Elwood, Nebraska. And so that's out here in the middle of the state. Let's see, Kearney, Elm Creek, Lexington, Johnson Lake, and Elwood is the town that I'm sort of from, or that I grew up by. I actually grew up south of Elwood. If you go all the way down to Highway 18 and head west, my grandfather's farm is right here. And you go around the corner, there's an old, there was a church site, there's a cemetery here, there was an old school here, but my family's farm is just up the road right here. And as I was growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, my family's farm was part of a larger sort of conglomerate of the family's farms, right? So this is my dad's place, but my grandfather's place was right here. And then I had an uncle that lived down here. And then we had another uncle who lived on Grandpa's farm. And then the other folks that lived around here, this is Bill Schutz lived at this location. Marvin lived at this location, and Vic lived at this location. They're all cousins, fairly distant cousins actually by the time I got around. And in fact, I didn't really know them that well, even though we lived, just sort of around the corner from one another and shared the same last name. So that gives you an indication of how long this sort of group of people has been on this landscape, right? Now, this was the 1980s, 1990s. By the time I got to high school and college in the mid to late 1990s, the agricultural sector didn't really look like a path to go down for a young person like me. So I went to college and then went on to law school. But during the time that I was on the farm, and the time that I came back to the farm, and the time that my dad continued to operate the farm, we saw a lot of things. And so the agriculture that I sort of have in my mind as the baseline that I grew up with was an agriculture that was characterized by a high amount of labor. And it was relatively small relative to what we have today. And the prices were low, right? I mean, back then we were talking about corn prices triggering counter-cyclical payments in the range of $1.85. And it wasn't that long ago, although I'm getting older, I think, as we speak. And people were actually hitting payment limitations on those sorts of payments at those sorts of prices. Other things that were going on at the time, swine was really going industrial. And we were having a lot of land use fights over county zoning and that sort of stuff around here. And another thing that happened in this era was Lexington, the town to the north, of where I went to high school in Elwood, Lexington had a plant for New Holland, which was an equipment manufacturer, which is still around. But they closed that plant in Lexington, and the entity that took it over was IBP, and IBP was a packing house. It's now Tyson. I think, it's now Tyson, and so the population of Lexington actually changed remarkably over the course of my sort of adulthood. So that's kind of where I'm from and sort of what I've seen. The farming, like I said, was very, very labor intensive and very sort of diversified. We had about 500 acres of cropland at that time. We also had hogs that we did farrow to finish on, about 120 head of sows that we would farrow twice a year. And then Dad also had a dairy herd of about 70 head with a 4-stall barn. So there was a lot of labor involved with that agriculture that I grew up with. It's much, much different now. In fact, my brother still farms out in this area along with my dad, and really sort of two people can farm on the order of 6,000, 6,500 acres in this particular area. The irrigation is under pivots. We used to do it with gravity irrigation and pipe and that sort of thing. The equipment is much bigger, much quicker. So the dry land is pretty farmable, and then the irrigation isn't as labor intensive either. So really just massive changes that we've seen in the agricultural industry over the years. And so that's kind of where I come from as far as my experience with agriculture. The parts of ag history that I saw too had some darker aspects of it. I saw a lot of farm bankruptcy. I saw a lot of people getting out of that work. I saw a lot of people getting second jobs at factories or in town and that sort of thing in order to get health insurance, in order to just pay the bills so that they could keep the farm. So I have a bit of an understanding of sort of, some of the sacrifices that were made in order to continue to own and hold these lands that we see in Nebraska. And I have the sense that there's a lot of that in this country. The people that are left are the ones who are parts of families that endured a tremendous amount of sacrifice in order to get to where they are in many instances. So I think it's important to, sort of always remember that. It also gives you a little bit of an introduction to the value set that I bring to my work in this particular area. So I saw that sort of sacrifice. I saw that sort of work. I grew up when small farms really did matter, and there was a big push to save the family farm, and that seemed to matter. Farm aid, all of those sorts of things were things that I experienced in my youth. Kind of a far cry from what we see today, I think, in the agricultural industry. But in any event, my professional life has gone on to sort of remain in agriculture in the law school. So I'm a lawyer. I went to undergrad at Kearney, and I went to law school here at the university. And I was lucky enough to get a job with the university teaching at the law school and teaching in the agricultural arena, specifically with regard to all of the different pieces of policy that are related to agriculture. And really that's one of the things to keep in mind as we move in here, right? The U.S. has a very long history of supporting agriculture with a huge amount of policy. It's really massive, dating all the way to land distribution through the Homestead Act, the Reclamation Act, which is very relevant to water use in the United States, the Morrill Act, which is really sort of, there's two pieces of that. The second of which came in 1890, where we created a cadre of black universities. Hatch Acts, the Farm Bill, and various provisions of our tax code. So there's a tremendous amount of law associated with agriculture and policy that supports this production system that we have in play. And that's the body of law that I study, and we call it agricultural law. And it is really a broad area of study. I tend to specialize in different pieces of it. I tend to focus on the environmental and natural resources side of things, but I also spend a great deal of time with some of the business law aspects of ag as well. And of course, policy. That is, those normative choices that are sort of embedded in the legislation, in the development of legislation. So that's what I do. And lawyers, we do a lot of different ways, and law professors do a lot of different things in terms of analyzing the law and judging its performance. We work with people from a lot of different disciplines to try to get a better handle on what the law can do, what the law should do, what the law has done. And so that's one of the sort of pieces of my professional life that I bring to bear on this particular subject. But one thing I think that I've learned is that the law is really, it's a powerful tool, right? It shapes and reflects our collective judgments about what's right and wrong. And it's both sturdy, right? It tends to be sticky, but it's also malleable, right? We can change it in lots of different ways. So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about as far as racial impacts of agriculture and agricultural policy, they weren't inevitable, right? We created a lot of them, and we could change them if we have the will to do so. So that's the kind of stuff that I learned when I went to law school. It's the sort of stuff that I've wrestled with over the scope of my career. And really sort of we ask questions about, what does the law tell us about what we think is right and wrong? How has it changed? What hasn't changed? What's the law done? What's it failed to do? Now, before we get started on agriculture and resource use, the second piece of the study, there's one thing that I sort of want to discuss and sort of put on the table. And it really has to do with my status as a white male professor talking about race. Right? I am not a minority in any sense of the word. Maybe my rural upbringing makes me a bit of a minority interest, but not in the sense that we're talking about today. And when I bring my voice to bear on these issues, when I talk about it, I try to do it with that underlying understanding that I don't really know what discrimination's like. I've not been the subject of injustice of this sort. I've been regarded as a hayseed Midwesterner a couple of times, but it has not anything that's really close to what we're talking about with race and other forms of invidious discrimination. So, if anything, I've seen it from the other side, growing up and through some of just sort of, third party views of it through legal study. So I think it's important to have that on the table and to let anyone who's listening know that I'm fully open to the observation that I don't really know, right? That I haven't lived it. There's also sort of another level of discomfort associated with these discussions. And that's really the idea that there's something accusatory about what we're talking about when we critically examine the racial implications of our agricultural system. And that's part of what goes on, I think, with discussions about structural racism or discriminatory effect, is this idea that we're trying to attribute fault or blameworthiness. And we see this most clearly with reactions to the notion of privilege, right? I'm not privileged. I worked hard my whole life. Yeah, but I didn't have to go through some of the difficulties associated with the color of my skin or the language that I speak or those sorts of things. So it's one reason why I've mentioned my background and sort of these hardworking folks who now occupy farmland is because, a claim of structural racism or a vestige of past discrimination doesn't necessarily mean that those occupants are to blame. But as one of those occupants, it's very difficult to figure out what to do with observations that point out failures of a system that you've devoted your life's work to. Those are difficult conversations. But I think, we have to be honest about the past, and we have to be honest about what we're doing and its impacts, and hopefully work toward a better future. So that's the personal and professional background. Let's talk about agriculture and sort of resource use. So the first link, and this is the first link I want to set up, is this link between ag and resources. And this one isn't difficult, I think, to comprehend for anybody in ag or anybody in environmental studies or natural resources management. Agriculture is quite simply a massive user and consumer of resources. Land, water, habitat. There's no bigger disruptor of the way the world worked than the massive use of land and water for agricultural production. It's frankly it's amazing the level of land use and hydrologic change that we've wrought from farming or for farming. Even in the ranching sector, right? Decimating bison herds and predators in order to open up grazing lands, eliminating fire from the natural regime and from the ecosystem and so on. Settlement impacts are massive, and you get a sense of that as you look at this landscape that we occupy. The point, let's talk a little bit about the law's role in that, right? So strong was this desire for bringing land into production and harnessing water and those sorts of things, is that the language of reclamation was brought to bear on it. So policy and law, of course, facilitated this sort of stuff. This is the North Platte Project, which is, of course, relevant to what we see. But, the idea was that rivers should be dammed, right? That, and I don't mean damned, I mean dammed. Rivers should be dammed, grassland should be turned, wetlands should be drained, all so that we can produce things that humans need more directly, I suppose, than what those ecosystems were providing at the outset. Aquifers are pumped in order to make the sort of production choices that we've pursued. We utilize technology and synthetic fertilizers, as well as, the application of manure. We contribute to things like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. This is by our very own Andrea Bash. And then, of course, we've got all sorts of risks associated with nitrogen contamination of groundwater, wrought from this idea of harnessing this ecological system in order to produce the goods that we need in order to have the society that we want. And the law plays a very big role, right? And one of the things that the law does is it uses things like property. It uses things like permits in order to give people rights to land and to give people rights to water. And sometimes we just let people pollute. And sometimes we place upon them duties to not pollute based on what we think the proper allocation of obligations are. And we do all of that with law. And we can make different choices if we want to. So that's sort of ag and its relationship to the environment. It's a resource. It has resource impacts, right? But it also consumes, uses, and is embedded within it is an allocation of resources, a distribution of resources, the land, the water, and those sorts of things. Kind of like with water when we talk about quantity regulation versus quality regulation. Okay, so that's where a lot of our resources get used, is in agriculture. But we're here to talk not so much about environmental impact, but about the racial aspects of those environmental impacts and the racial aspects of the distribution of these resources. Okay, so the resource allocation, race and agricultural resource distribution, the third part of this talk. It's not difficult to show that agriculture is a white endeavor at this point. Looking at farms today and the race of people who own them, it is very, very white. We have, and this is not the table. Oh, excuse me. The table I was looking for. And so the race of whites in the United States, 73% of the population, owner-operators of agricultural land, 96% of the population, right? 86% of farm tenants. So racial and ethnic characteristics of owner-operators and tenants. And I believe there's one more up here, racial, ethnic, and gender characteristics of landlords, owner-operators, tenants, and farm laborers. You can pull any number of papers that can show very easily this racial composition. It is very, very white. And so the question is, how did it become that way? Has it always been this way? Did we create this? If it was something that we created, is there ways in which we could maybe undo that? And the answer, of course, to all of those questions is yes. And we have a number of different people who have written really great work on this. Jessica Shoemaker works at the law school. She's one of my colleagues. And for the class, I assigned her paper to you to take a look at. And I think it's an excellent paper describing sort of how property systems have helped contribute to this particular distribution of land, of agricultural resources. So this is her paper, Fee Simple Failures. Another person that you should have in mind is Tom Mitchell. Thomas Mitchell is a 2020 MacArthur Fellow, and he's been writing about black land loss for decades, and just is wonderful work. Here's one of his main pieces from 2001 dealing with black land loss. But let's get specific, right? How did this get here? What happened? Why is it so white? And well, how did we get the land, right? The land wasn't white to begin with, right? And so we got the land by taking it. by displacing and decimating indigenous populations, aided by law, right? Cases like Johnson v. McIntosh, right, where the court just simply concluded that indigenous people didn't hold title. And then the government pushed out occupancy, pushed many occupiers out through some purchases, through some non-consensual transfers. Treaties were made, reservations created, government changed course. We implemented policies of allotment. Title was transferred to individuals, and forced sales of surplus lands to non-Indians resulted in sort of the situation we have now, where there's 56 million acres of trust reservation lands, as well as reserved water rights associated with them. And we'll have a speaker down the road who's going to speak to all of that. Also, Mexican landowners whose rights were to be preserved under a treaty that we had at the time lost those lands to white courts, a lack of documentation, and much of that was accomplished at the hands of military efforts. Latin labor was also imported. And so we brought populations in through things like the Bracero program during and after World War II in order to work the land. So we've got a long history of taking land from indigenous populations. And you can find all sorts of historical accounts of this. One that I have run into that has always been very surprising to me, given the way that I grew up, was the decimation of buffalo herds, right? I'm from the middle of Nebraska, where there's North Platte and Buffalo Bull Cody, and all of those things were sort of celebrated as part of our heritage. But the decimation of the buffalo herd was a way of eliminating a food supply for an indigenous population. It was warfare, right? And yet we don't appreciate it as such, I don't think, growing up, and perhaps we should. There's, when we see things like this, I think I lost one of the slides. I had a slide of, those piles of buffalo skulls that you will see in some of the history books, and those are very problematic, right, to say the least. Not only for an ecological perspective, but also for the population that we were really trying to get at when we decimated those herds. Okay, so that's how we got the land, right? Then what did we do with the land? Well, we distributed it, right? Ultimately, we distributed it. We held it for a long time, but then we decided on a policy of distribution. And that policy of distribution, it didn't overlook the racial composition of the population. The Homestead Act was built and was rolled out in order to give everyone access to property. Ultimately, it's not like there weren't any growing pains associated with this, but we did distribute land in ways that were cognizant of the racial composition of people and freed slaves, and so on and so forth during this era. A lot of that land was, and we supported it too. The Morrill Acts, of course, our land grant institutions were created in order to support settlement, in order to support agriculture. And we did that on a somewhat biracial basis, including the second Morrill Act, the 1890 Historical Black Land Grant Act, that worked toward at least some level of racial equality. But of course, that is oversimplifying things, right? The land was still taken, and now it's being used to facilitate this sort of development and settlement. So there are definitely a lot of things in our history that we have to be cognizant, especially as we sit on the grounds of a land grant university ourselves. So we supported families with institutions. We ultimately, though, failed to support the occupants of this land. And one of the things that you can look at over history, and it's quite a bit of time elapsed from the original Homestead Acts, but the institutional apparatus that we set up to help farmers, the USDA, was characterized by county committees. That was our main administrative mechanism for delivering these services. And those county committees were locally elected, but they were also locally elected, right? Which means that if there's racism in the society, if there's racism in the culture, it's going to be reflected in the administrative apparatus. And it was. It was for black farmers, it was for Native American farmers, and it was for Hispanic and women farmers. So the institutions that we created helped perpetuate this cycle of discrimination. And we're now trying to make amends, and that's what these links are for. The Pigford case was litigation associated with black farmers. The KeepsEagle's case was associated with Native Americans, and that was recently settled. And this Janie Hipp is just a wonderful person running this program. The administration has set up a system for settling claims for Hispanic and women farmers who are the victims of discrimination at the hands of USDA, in part because of the administrative apparatus that we set up. All of this, of course, led to an ownership structure in agriculture that persists today that is very, very white. And the land is in white families. And how many of you have heard of legislation or policy rationales that seek to protect the family farm? And so the question to ask is, who do you think those families are, right? I mean, just Google family farm and look at the images. This is photography. The family farm of the United States at this point is a white institution. And it has become that way through a series of choices and a series of laws and policies and failures that have gotten us to where we are. That's not to say, remember, that the current occupants of this, it's not accusatory, right? But it is necessary, but it is the truth. And so we have to concern ourselves with these choices. And when we talk about the policy that we pursue today, those policies are pursued in ways that benefit this population, right? Total farm relief for the past few years has run in the $60 billion range. Who does that money go to? As land and its associated water values go up as a result of that, who benefits from that and who doesn't? Intestacy laws that allow giving land to heirs, they facilitate giving land to heirs, are going to perpetuate white ownership. Tax laws that are meant to aid those transitions also do that. No taxes at death. Revenue from which we could actually, fund other opportunities aren't collected because we want to preserve the family farm. Stepped up basis that gives heirs a capital gain sort of shelter, a high stepped up basis at death of their parents, also acts to perpetuate white land ownership. And Jessica has written about this. It's property tax relief, right? Primarily for agricultural land. Who does that benefit and who doesn't benefit? I always ask when we get in discussions about property tax relief, who's going to pay more and why, right? And so those are the sorts of questions that we really have to be asked, given the history and the status of agriculture. We haven't acted to replace policies that we had in the past trying to limit absentee ownership. We haven't done any of that. And property tax limits that are currently in view for the legislature, those are going to have an impact on these rural lands. They're going to provide benefits to some and burdens to others, and we would do well to at least consider the racial implications of that. Okay. So that's resource allocation, right? So there's definitely a strong racial component, a strong racial history to our distribution of agricultural resources, land, water, so on and so forth. But let's turn to the fourth one, race and agricultural environmental impacts. And this is really just taking us into the world of environmental justice, which is probably something that many of you have seen, right? So environmental justice is just the idea, it's not just the idea, it's the idea that minorities and poor populations tend to bear a higher cost when it comes to environmental harms. It's definitely the case in flood-prone areas. It's definitely the case with areas that are near industrial sites. We see a little bit of this in Nebraska with the Alt-N project up by, or the Altan ethanol plant up by Meade, where we've got at least strong indications that there was a very significant pollution resulting from that particular project in a rural area. And I don't think there's as much racial overtone associated with that, but there's definitely a rural aspect to it. And locating environmentally damaging activities in areas that are rural because they're rural is something that can also pose problems. In many parts of the country, doing that also has a strong racial impact because the rural areas are also black or brown. And we see that in North Carolina and places like that, Mississippi. Water quality concerns, specifically nitrate contamination, those sorts of things arise. And so, you can, just look at the census data and you can see where populations are, where lots of hog confinements are on this eastern seaboard. Nitrate contamination and polluted runoff, and then the Gulf hypoxia. We see, aspects of that are racial as well. And you can find a number of different papers on this particular subject. Here's one on environmental injustice in Mississippi hogs, doing a geospatial, regression to identify those sorts of harms. Environmental inequities with water policy. This paper is actually about California, which is interesting because there were efforts in California to avoid these environmental justice impacts. And this paper says that you did a pretty good job, but it does look like Hispanic populations are receiving less water in these dry years. And so there's cognizance and there is action. And sometimes it's not complete. We've got environmental justice overtones to the nuisance litigation in North Carolina. This was a very large jury verdict that was handed down in the past couple of years, has been appealed and affirmed in a pretty famous case, actually, that was decided just this last year. This is where large hog confinements in the eastern part of North Carolina were polluting for years and years and years, right, and sort of on the doorstep of the populations who lived in those rural areas. And those populations in those rural areas, that rural landscape is a bit different than the rural landscape we have in Nebraska, just in terms of population density. Rural North Carolina has people in it, and has a lot of people of color who experienced this harm. If you were to locate those facilities in Nebraska, one, you wouldn't find the same levels of people of color, at least in many parts of the state, and also we're much more sparsely populated, so maybe those harms aren't as, as clearly felt by neighbors. Okay, but it's not to say that there aren't rural aspects of race to take into account, even in Nebraska's land use. If you just look at some of the areas of Nebraska, the minority populations in some of these communities are quite large. If Lexington has a nitrate population or a nitrate problem, that's going to affect and have an adverse impact on a very large Hispanic population. Same for places like the eastern side of Grand Island, or the or Schuyler, or the eastern side of Columbus, right? These are Madison, Nebraska. These are places with very high minority populations. And if we have contamination of groundwater resources and surface water resources, it's going to have an adverse impact on those populations, as well as the white populations in other rural parts of the state. So there's definitely concerns to be aware of. The environmental justice aspects of agricultural production are significant and have significant racial overtones to them. So that's something to think about. And again, the choices are there, right? The choices are ours to be made through law and policy. There are ways of regulating the discharge of pollutants. There are ways of regulating non-point sources of agricultural pollution, but we've not seen fit yet to do that. And that is having adverse impacts on populations, and sometimes very disproportionate impacts on minority populations. Fifth, race responsibility in agriculture. Remember, agriculture, we devote a tremendous amount of resources to it, a tremendous amount of policy favor to agriculture. land access, water access. We protect water access by protecting transfers of water resources from agricultural to non-agricultural uses. Agriculture is the preferred user of natural resources in the United States generally and in Nebraska in particular. And so one thing that we have to think about is what sort of responsibility comes with that kind of favor, right? If any. And I think, one thing to think about is the extent to which agriculture should be called upon to account for the other racial impacts of the system that we've created. And one of those is the meat industry. Nebraska's resources are devoted to agriculture, but more specifically, they're devoted to the feed and the production of cattle, hogs, chickens, other forms of poultry, right? There are exceptions, but the lion's share of our rangeland and cropland and consumed waters that are pumped from aquifers, water that's diverted, nutrient use, nutrient loss, all of that is really undertaken in order to produce meat. And that meat connection has a very significant racial aspect to it. And COVID has revealed a problem that has been there for a very long time. COVID taught us that one of the most important pieces of our production agriculture in this state is the packing house. And the COVID impacts on packing house workers have been reported. Despite a lack of transparency in the data in this state, other states have been more transparent. But exploiting this labor force has been a problem for a very long time. And we're seeing it, we saw it with testing, we saw it with PPE, we are seeing it with vaccinations, and we are going to have to grapple with this problem. And I think it's not a packing house problem. I think it's an agricultural problem. I don't think it's an answer for us to say that farmers aren't packing houses and the big three or the big four or whatever, they are the ones that are accountable for this. And, I suppose that's kind of correct, but farmers have agency in policy making. And the ag sector will tout itself to the end of the week as the largest economic driver of the state. It involves 1 in 4 jobs. And that may be true writ large, but if we're going to paint agriculture as that big for purposes of economic benefits, then I think we ought to paint agriculture as that big with regard to the racial disparities, community responsibilities, and those aspects of the meat packing industry and the agricultural industry within the state. And packing aspects are just one aspect of our food system labor. H-2A workers come here, they're held in jobs, and we basically, have situations that are very racially charged. So, what do we do about all of this, right? The first step, I think, and this is Jessica Shoemaker and I are starting a project called the Rural Reconciliation Project, and it's based upon rural spaces that involve agriculture and those sorts of things. But the first step in a reconciliation kind of regime is to tell the truth, to be honest about where we've been, and then figure out what exactly it is that we're going to do about it, right? And it's not so much about allocating blame. It's really about moving forward, right? And there are maybe debts that have to be repaid. There are consequences that we have to consider and think about. But the first step is to get a good handle on what's happened and to tell the truth. And that's what things like this can be a part of. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is to take a close look at the institutions that we've created and see what it is. I think, one piece of it is to spend more time with people who don't have the same backgrounds that we have, people who've experienced this personally. And this is something that agriculture really has to get into, and I think that our educational system has to get into. And of course, we are, right? That's one reason why we're having this discussion today. But, everything in agriculture is very white. The FFA, for Pete's sakes, is very white. And this is one, set of stories that has arisen. And the FFA is undertaking significant efforts to try to diversify their organization. The American Agricultural Law Association, which I'm a member of, is also a very, very white organization. And we are making efforts to try to diversify, and we must. We must, because people who are in the position of minorities who look out and do not see people who look like them and people who have their backgrounds in positions of power, in positions like with the FFA, like with the American Ag Law Association, professors in universities and all those sorts of things. If you don't see those people in those positions, it has an impact. Stated differently, seeing people in those positions, the appearance of diversity or diverse appearances, I think it helps, right? It helps. And that's one of the steps that we have to undertake. We also have to do better in our larger governmental institutions. There's been a lot of discussion about this new secretary and whether he's the person who can remedy some of these problems. Nate Rosenberg has a series of articles on this particular subject. It's worth looking into it. In fact, the New York Times just ran an article the other day on priorities in Black-owned farms. So I think we need to do more. And we will, I think. We will do more. And we have the ability to do that with law and policy and the stuff that we do on a daily basis. This is just one article of many articles on cross-cultural conversations in the law school classroom, and we see this sort of information coming to us through the university and through lots of folks who are concerned about diversity and inclusion. This is one of the things that I'm working on. It's one of the things that our university is working on. And this is an important piece in moving forward to try to deal with and atone for and reconcile this past with where we are and where we want to be. So that's a little bit on race and agriculture and natural resources. And really, I mean, when we think about it, what we're doing is devoting a resource base to an industry that has very significant racial problems associated with it. And the question is, do we want to do that? Is that what we want to devote these resources to? Or should we do better? Should we do better? And I think we can do better. And so as we move forward, hopefully we will. Thank you for your time. Hopefully I didn't run too over time. And I will be on the line shortly to answer questions. Thank you. Oh, one thing that I did want to leave off is to, if there's something that I've said that is contrary to your view, I'm more than willing to listen and hear what you have to say. I'm not trying to be dismissive, and I know that things are always much more complicated than they appear. But we do need to begin these conversations and get a handle on what people think and what people understand about our history and what our history actually is in order to move through this. So thank you. Jesse, how are you? Can you hear me? You're muted, Jesse.
Let me.
There you go.
Anthony, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, there we go. I'm unmuted. That was a really smooth segue. I'm glad. It's nice when technology works out for the better.
If you ever give a talk, I would recommend not recording it and then watching yourself and then trying to step in and do questions. This is strange, but in any event, it looks like there's still some people on, so that's good.
Yeah, this is awesome, actually. I did want to quickly mention that we had 73 participants. That, to my knowledge, is an all-time high for any water center seminar in person or on Zoom. So I've been texting with coworkers. We're really floored about that. One thing just to put right off the bat to you, Anthony, is we had a couple comments come in, and maybe you already saw these, asking if you could include the links that you used in the presentation and put those in some kind of a document.
I can do that. I have that window still open. I'll just pull each one of those tabs and put them in a list and then share it to you. Do you want to put it on the page with the recording or whatever?
Sure. Yeah, you could send it to me.
Yeah,
Thank you.
We can do that. And in fact, I found the link to the photos of the buffalo skulls. I think that's a pretty powerful one. It was unfortunate that one didn't show up, but just piles and piles of buffalo skulls. The sort of picture. I did want to, and I just did it again. It's because that damn Atlantic article refers to the American bison is buffalo. And I apologize for that. I wanted to say bison. And I realized that I said buffalo a couple of times. So any questions that we can get into?
Chittaranjan, Dr. Ray, you had a question earlier on that you typed. I can't get to it now because so many things have happened in the chat subsequently. Do you want to, you're welcome to unmute yourself.
Yes, I have it.
Or Tricia, okay, if you'd like to read it, please.
Okay. There are several women farmers in Nebraska, mostly white, maybe a few Hispanic or Japanese ancestry, and mostly in middle ages. Many of these women are landowners and some could be tenants. Do these folks face problems or feel that they get fleeced while buying insurance, doing commodity options or general financial transactions? And he's got another one after that answer.
I haven't seen systematic, studies of that question, but I do hear a lot of anecdotes. And I think it is still the case that I don't want to call it a rural problem or an urban problem, but it is the case that when you see people who aren't typically thought of as farmers, you tend not to revert in your mind to thinking of those people as farmers. And I think it happens with women. I think it happens with minorities. And I think it's, that's one of the problems that we run into. I've heard a lot. You see a lot of stuff on Twitter. I follow a lot of people on Twitter who are producers, female producers and minority producers, and they do report that there's a lot of, if not overt discrimination, that sort of, they call it microaggression, but that sort of, feeling that you just don't quite belong with the group that sort of holds the keys. And that's one of those problems.
And the second part to his question is, how does this look in the case for a young UNL female graduate returning home to take care of dad's farming due to circumstances such as health, death, etc.?
I think it looks better than it ever has, but I don't know that it looks great, right? Some of it depends too on the situation. If it's somebody who's returning home to a place where she's from, or he's from, then I think there's, part of the family and, it's a community, right? It's a small community. I think the more difficult situations are the situations where newcomers are coming in that look much different than the communities that are there. And those I think are the very difficult situations that you run into. Female farmers that return home to the family farm and take over the family farm in communities that their families have always been there are probably going to be by definition white. But they're also going to be a part of that community that already exists. And the question we run into is, how do we open up these communities to people who haven't been there for a very long time? Because the people that have been there for a very long time have been there for a very long time because of some very poor choices, I suppose, that have been made. And so that I think is the challenge. But I would agree that there's a number of different fronts on which we need to be working.
Jesse, do you want me to continue or do you want to take over?
Well, I think Anthony probably can see there's been a couple things in the chat. Anthony, are you able to read those? Yeah.
So Matthew Chen says it's quite difficult even for white people to get into agriculture without some sort of history in the industry. How can you approach diversification while there are inherent boundaries that do not allow even the most privileged to mess with the culture? And I don't know. So there are definitely barriers to entry. The biggest barrier to entry right now is financial. And money is cheap, but land is very, very expensive, and it's already owned by someone. And so you've got to find it for sale. These markets are very thin. It's very expensive, and then you need to have the financing. And we did learn from the 1980s that it's not a great idea to lend money when your debt to asset ratio is close to 100%. Just a bad situation to be in. So that means you got to have a really big down payment in order to get into it. And so it's really hard to get there. Even the folks that are out there now. So like my brother has bought a large farm, but he lives out there, right? And he's got his family out there. And so he's got a labor force that other newcomers wouldn't have access to. So there are lots of different barriers, I think, that are in play. So I think that's right to consider, like, what exactly are we going to do given the way that this industry is at this point? And that's the difficulty. It's definitely not easy at all to try to break down these barriers. There are things that can be done though. if one of the barriers is access to credit, we can make credit accessible. We've got a history of doing that, beginning farmer loans, those sorts of things. And we could give those out on a preferred basis to the people who have experienced a history of discrimination. Now that raises significant equity issues, but if we need to give some groups a leg up in order to get back to even, then maybe we do that. That's definitely a controversial proposition, though. And at the state level, it's so controversial that we've passed a constitutional amendment that tries to prohibit the practice in many instances. So it's definitely it's definitely a problem we need to work on. So I don't know the answers. I just know a little bit about the history and think that we need to really dig into these issues. And I think I thought the interesting thing about what I got into with the talk was how natural resources are related to this, because that land is the resource base of the state, and the resource base of the state is held by a group of folks that have come to be in that position because of the choices that we've made. So do we want to make the same choices going forward? That's kind of, going forward, there's one thing that we definitely want to do. We don't want to do that again, right? We don't want to make the mistakes that we've made in the past. And so we got to figure out what those mistakes were and then how we can avoid them. Talk a little bit more about the goals of the Rural Reconciliation Project that you're initiating. So one thing that we want to do is bring scholars together from a lot of different areas. We've got rural sociology, we've got some geographers, and then, ag economists and those sorts of folks that are looking at, and historians that are looking at, what has happened. And then that's the whole idea, is to really sort of get a handle on what's happened, and dig past the folklore, right? We don't. So our next speaker is a guy named Adam Kalo, and Adam is going to talk about the yeoman myth, right? The shake in his talk is the shaky foundations of the beginning farmer movement. Imagine for a moment if it is the case that this whole idea of the Jeffersonian ideal was so much propaganda that we created. What does that do to us, right? What does that do to the underlying policy decisions that we've made? We've regarded the farmer today as sort of this vaulted status, but that is in part a function of the folklore associated with farming. What if that was built off of pretty shaky foundations? What if that was built off of the idea that we really just need people to settle the land so we can get Native Americans off of it? If that's what it was built on, then it really does. It can diffuse some of the stronger sort of gut reaction policy bases that people have. And that can be important when it comes time to talk about, property tax relief or, water allocation decisions or those sorts of things. If we're not still harboring the same underlying biases for this thing that we've always been told is wonderful and great, then maybe we can make different choices a little bit more easier, or at least maybe consider the merits a little bit closer. So those are the sorts of things that we want to get into, right? Are those sorts of, very critical examinations of policy choices that we've made based on people who study and have expertise in history, sociology, economics, law, so on and so forth. What do you find is the biggest hindrance in attaining racial justice in the agricultural sector in Nebraska? What could be some best strategies to overcome these hindrances? Well, that's the biggest the biggest hindrance to overcoming racial injustice in Nebraska is the favoritism we have for carrying on familiar ownership of ag land. Stated simply, that's the biggest hurdle that we have. I mean, we deploy tax policy, farm policy, and everything to save the family farm, to keep people on the land that they have. And even economic policies that increase the value of this property beyond that the newcomers could acquire it at, we don't care about that because it increases the value of present estates. I mean, we're headed toward a feudal sort of system where the owners own the stuff and the rest of the people work. And I don't know how we're going to get anybody into that lord class, right? That is the biggest hindrance, I think, that we're looking at these days. And like I started off with in my discussion, the people that are there, right? That own my family, your family, whose ever families that own it. These are estates that we created through hard work and sacrifice over a few generations. So I don't know if it's it's the biggest hindrance, but I don't know that it's necessarily nefarious, right, in its very nature. But there were some choices made in pieces of this, I think, that were a problem. Like, what do you do about USDA? USDA definitely did not support minority, Hispanic, Black, women, Native American farmers in the same way that it did white farmers. And that's one reason why it's so white now. So how do we think about that? How do we want to remedy that? When the beneficiaries, we look at them today and we say, are those the bad guys? They don't seem like the bad guys. Who are the bad guys, right? And that's the thing about our current political scene, is we seem so dead set on finding bad guys and having fights and winning and that sort of thing. But that's not the nature of policymaking. The most difficult thing associated with policymaking is the choice that you're faced with every day between one great truth and another great truth, between two good guys, and trying to find something that is better than what we have now when there is no enemy. Right? And that's I think the hardest thing. It's the biggest hindrance of this thing. So I don't want to lead anybody to believe that there's easy answers out there. There's no easy answers out there, but that's why this reconciliation thing can maybe help us start thinking about, is 1031 a great idea? I mean, if we need revenue to try to do some of these projects, is shielding a massive amount of capital gain from any taxation ever and facilitating the transfer of that real estate from one generation to the next, is that the best thing that we can be doing under these circumstances? Do we want land to be sold, right? I mean, if one of the things that we want to do is, keep people on the farm so they don't have to sell their land, is that necessarily the best policy? I mean, don't we want that land to move and get in other hands at some point? Because those hands might be the hands of people that really could do more with it, and it could help remedy some past discrimination too. So fun stuff. Okay, have I worked with any artists, writers, and do you have any thoughts about how the arts might help contribute to the Tell the Truth aim of the Rural Reconciliation Project? I was just joking with somebody about the nature of law and whether or not, so law is kind of a science, but not really. It's probably closer to art than it is science. We try to run some numbers once in a while, but empirical approaches to legal study are, they're sort of a specialty. And so maybe the lawyers are really artists at the end of the day, but that aside, I think you mean the fine arts, right? And I think that is a hugely important aspect of it. And, authors like Ted Genoways and Carson Vaughn and Wendell Berry and Wes Jackson, and those folks they're hugely important, I think, to this effort. And in fact, there's a guy named Eric Freifogel at Illinois and other folks who really do talk about how the arts have an impact on the views we have of agriculture and of work and of capital and those sorts of things. And I think it's very important. Pop culture, I haven't paid. There's a show called Yellowstone. I haven't watched it. I don't know. Things like that, they can have an impact, I think, on social views of agriculture. Ag does a lot of, wanting to tell a story, tell your story. Some of those stories really aren't that good, right? Like, I mean, if I'm owning a poultry operation, right, that's not the best story to tell, right? I mean, if I'm running, 10,000 head of hogs in a massive pork operation, it's not the greatest story to many folks, right? But some folks would view that story as wonderful, right? They'll see the efficiency and they'll see the the lack of disease and that sort of thing. And they'll say, wow, that's the best sort of model of hog production that we've been able to come up with so far, or poultry or cattle or whatever. So the stories, I think, are very important. Do we have good stories to tell? Well, what's a good story and what's not? I think these stories, Leah Douglas with the fern and the stories that she's talking about, and her continuous work since COVID began about the plight of meatpacking workers, that's important stuff. somebody hopefully will tell the story about the livestock that were culled in the wake of these meatpacking plant shutdowns too, right? That's an important piece of it. I saw in the news Paul Hamill said yesterday that Department of Agriculture reported 10,000 head of hogs were exterminated in Nebraska alone, hundreds of thousands nationwide, but 10,000 of them were exterminated alone over the course of the last year when those packing houses shut down. And I want to know how they did it, right? Because one of the most effective ways of eliminating large numbers of those animals is to shut down the buildings that they're in. You seal them off and you just let them get hot and they die. And that's one very effective way of doing it. And it's an approved method of doing it. But if that happened, I want to know about it. And I haven't heard anything about it, right? So I want to know how we did that. And then I want to know those stories, because I want to know what our agricultural sector really looks like, because we are devoting a huge amount of our resources, our tax dollars, our water, our land, to this system that is doing these things. And I don't know if that's just. And I just want the information. I just want the training. And that, I think, is where the arts and humanities can come in. We need good journalists and we need good storytellers. Repeat the last name. I don't know which last name. Adam Kalo, I think. You can look at, we have the website for our project is ruralreconcile.org. ruralreconcile.org. And we've got a blog there that we're running. It's called the Rural Review. And then we've got a speaker series this semester. We had Lisa Pruitt last week who came and spoke, and the video of her presentation is on the website too. Famous people like Gates or Buffett can contribute significantly, including minorities in farm sector. Now, Bill Gates seems to have 20,000 acres in Nebraska. What can they do differently now? And I have seen that. And when I see that, I don't know what Gates is going to do with that land. I just don't know. Hopefully something that can help people, right? The worry that I have isn't so much Gates as an owner, it's the financial asset class that has become U.S. farmland. And so there's a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange that owns, I think, a couple of 100,000 acres now of land across the U.S. Some of it's in Nebraska, so a lot of it's in California, the almond groves and that sort of thing of California. And then we see a lot of investment from TIAA and the Harvard Endowment in the Cerrado in Brazil. And so one worry I think that both farmers and public policy folks have is what happens when we further separate capital from labor, and then we make that capital a financial asset class whose value is being driven by these trades in the market, right? Not so much from the income, but really as a sort of speculative enterprise. And we see that happen in lots of different places. You see it with, real estate in San Francisco. We see it in a lot of different places. So our financial system and the way in which we deal with assets could actually have a pretty adverse impact on the producers we have now, and also, folks that want to make some inroads on that current distribution of assets. It's difficult. I mean, producers really hate it because, the one way of locking in the biggest cost that you have as a producer is to own the land. If you don't own the land, your rent's going to go up, right? And you can maybe get a long-term lease to try to lock in that production cost. And once you get your production costs sort of figured out, then you can make choices about production and marketing that can get you to that profitable level, right? But if you don't own the land and you can't get a long-term lease, then the rent seeker is going to eat up that profit on a continuing basis, and your production costs will go up along with your income, and you're sort of left in a really precarious position with thin margins. So producers don't like it when they have to compete for agricultural land for people that are going to be long-term owners and who are owning it as a financial investment. So there's room there for, I think, common ground. That can take the form of wanting to sort of preserve the landed class that we have right now, which is not the greatest outcome for racial justice, but it's also, a fight against, I suppose, putting producers in a difficult place. So that's what I see with the Gates thing. But then again, right? Then again, if we've got big companies with a strong social agenda buying large tracts of real estate, what could they do with that, right? What can they make it available to? And there's also other, so it's not as simple as just like prohibiting corporate ownership. Let's just prohibit, and we used to do that. But if we just prohibit corporate ownership, yeah, we keep TIAA out of it, right? And maybe we keep Gates out of it. Maybe that's not a good thing, but we also would keep out of it, in depending on how you structure it, employee-owned enterprises. And what if you had a large cadre of minority farmers who got together and had the financial wherewithal to do it, and they buy a large chunk of land and they own it, they own the capital, and they pay themselves a wage to work, and all that's a good thing, but it's corporately owned, but it's like high V corporate ownership, right? Employee ownership. Maybe that's not a bad thing. So it's always more complicated than it seems. Do you think it's possible to diversify the field without first bridging the massive political and ideological differences between rural, ag-focused community and more racially diverse communities that we might see in larger cities? I actually think that many in rural places have more in common with urban dwellers than they realize. The problems of labor versus capital are common to urban spaces too, right? So, I mean, if you're a laborer in a rural area, just working for a wage, and you don't have these big, capital opportunities, you have more in common with downtown, or absent gentrification, to inner city folks than you do with suburbanites, right? So when I think of agriculture and who owns agricultural land in rural spaces, and I compare that to sort of urban spaces, I'm wondering if our ag land owners aren't more like suburbia, and our ag and our rural working class are more like inner city folks, right? In which case, there's a lot of, I think, ground to be gained by coming together. And so I think the whole urban rural, and that's one thing we want to get at with this reconciliation problem is, wait a minute, what do we mean by the urban rural divide? I mean, I kind of get it on broadband access, like just the geography of it, right? But when we talk about people, when we talk about rural people, like what are we talking about when we talk about rural people versus urban people? It's just people, right? There's lots of different labels that we can put on people that are more accurate, or more of a proxy for belief than rural versus urban. And even urban, like what does that mean? There's urban, there's suburban, there's gentrified downtown, urban. There are all sorts of different things. So I don't know that the geographic language of rurality, I don't think it translates nicely into an identity. But I worry, though, that people have sort of ascribed an identity to it, and that it impedes the development of these relationships that could be beneficial. Do I see regen as an opening for diversification of people involved in ag? I don't know. The concern I have with, if regenerative agriculture means an agriculture that is more profitable with less inputs, I don't have any hope that is going to somehow magically end up in the hands of minorities versus white folks, or in the hands of labor versus capital. Because if it makes money, then it's going to go big, right? And that's the way organics went. And so I don't think the nature of production can necessarily have a beneficial impact unless it's accompanied with other policies that try to keep the profitability of that practice in the hands of the folks that we think are more deserving of it, right? It's not to say that folks can't make money doing it, but the worry is that it scales, right? And most everything scales. So I don't know. The thing I wrestle with is one reason why there's not many people in rural areas and why populations have declined, especially with regard to agriculture, has been mechanization. It's really, just our labor needs now are so much less. My brother now operates 100 farms, right? 100 farms of six, if he's running 6,000 acres, a 600 acre farm in 1985 was a pretty big farm, right? 600 acres in 1945 was massive. So think about that just for a moment, just the families and the number of people and the employment in rural areas that has changed just since 1985, right? If one guy can farm 6,000 acres and that was 100 farms, that's just a massive displacement of people. So one thing I wonder about is, what do we need in rural areas? Well, we need opportunities. I don't know if those opportunities are going to come from agriculture unless there's some massive change in the amount of labor needed for agriculture. And I don't know where that's going to come from. I don't think technology is going to bring a bigger need for, coders or something like that to the agricultural sector. So I just don't know if agriculture holds the keys to rural growth, at least insofar as bringing people out. Maybe regen, maybe that increases the need for labor. Maybe we replace, some other input with labor, but that's a tough sell too. So I don't know. That's why one of the papers that I'm working on right now is what is rural's relationship with agriculture going forward? What does agriculture bring for the prospects of rural development if it doesn't involve increasing the need for labor or, and I mean labor writ large, not necessarily getting your hands dirty, but just jobs. I don't know. And if ag isn't it, what else might be out there that we could do in rural areas that would bring people there and create economic activity where people can, make a living and have a good life in a community? And that's the elephant in the room. I don't think it's ag. It might be recreational use of agricultural lands or lands that used to be agriculture or co-agricultural lands. I just don't know. Agritourism, but that creates a lot of low wage jobs. Are those that, maybe if we bring broadband access, we could get people that are actually, maybe I could teach from Elwood. And would I live in Elwood if I could teach at the law school from Elwood? I don't know actually if I would. My kids really have access to a lot of stuff here, right? My daughter played violin in the 5th grade. She's not going to do that in Elwood, but there's a different set of amenities there. So I don't know. That's even the telecommuting idea. If you don't have communities that are offering some of the amenities or the amenities that could perhaps be, or amenities that are comparable, I guess, in some way to the urban areas, I just don't know if people move there. If I'm young and single, do I go live in Sydney? But if I'm married and I've got a kid, maybe I do. But then, what do the schools look like? And that gets us into school finance. That gets us into property taxes. That gets us into sending income and sales tax money to rural areas and all of that. So that's why we want to do the Rural Reconciliation Project, is just what are we doing? What are the actual prospects for growth here? And if they're not, if we just don't have those prospects, then at some point we're going to have to be honest about that and say, the railroads put a bunch of people out there and we shouldn't have done that. And so maybe we need to turn more toward urban spaces and try to figure those out. I hope that's not the conclusion, but it's not off the table, I don't think. Yeah. That's on a dark day. On a dark day, I'll start thinking that way, but I try not to think that way. Do you think the further automation, mechanization of agriculture will impact the working class in the ag field? Yeah, that's the basic reason why we are where we are. A lot of people want to say, well, agriculture's sparse population, and the identity of the population, that's one thing. We had discrimination that pushed minorities out. That was definitely there. But the overall decrease in the amount of people that are required for agriculture is a direct result of mechanization. And the, distribution of assets among a capitalist class versus a labor class, that's a product of our economic system. So I sometimes joke that, look, that the problem with agriculture isn't the farm bill. The problem with agriculture is combines and capitalism, right? And so until you change either combines or capitalism, you're probably not going to go in any sort of different direction with your agricultural policy. And I think that's a different question than race and minority status and all of that. But I think just that overall growth in the industry. The more we save in terms of labor and man hours, the less people we're going to need for it. And that's been the biggest driver of rural decline, I think, in the past 50 years. And there's a lot of that I mean, it's super interesting to think about that, right? I mean, this is part of being honest about the truth. Who developed those technologies? How did we develop those technologies? We're sitting at a land grant institution. Did we have a hand in that? And if we had a hand in that, what does that do for the way in which we devote resources to institutions? When I say we don't want to make the mistakes again, we should figure out what are the mistakes, on what basis? How do we figure these things out? So I think these are tremendously difficult questions. Now, maybe the mechanization increases the need for expertise, which increases the need for people in the sorts of jobs that, a lot of your implement dealers now, your service folks are not so much people who can pull wrenches, but people that can push buttons and they understand the software and the coding and all. And so it increases the need for a specialized labor force. And so I think there's definitely those opportunities that can arise. These are all just very, very difficult questions. We've got a subsidy question. As long as the heavily subsidized industrial corn, soy, meat complex exists, the ability for young beginning farmers to enter ag is nearly impossible. I think that's true. It's very difficult to try to figure out the role of subsidies in that, and what we mean by subsidies. One of the biggest subsidies that we have right now is the renewable fuel standard. I mean, when we entered the ethanol fray in 2007 and 2008, we got into subsidizing agriculture in a big way by forcing the product to market. If we weren't forcing ethanol to market, then how much land would we be devoting to corn production today? And people could probably crunch those numbers and come up with that. The back of the envelope calculations that I have right now are that effectively, even if you discount ethanol production by the amount of product that goes into the feed for cattle, ethanol is still consuming on the order of the consuming production from on the order of 25 million acres. We have 9 million acres of irrigated cropland in Nebraska, I think, right around there. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. 25 million acres is a lot of land, and it's all going into fuel tanks right now, right? So, I mean, if you take meat off the table, we still have ethanol, and that's a policy choice that we made, and it's employed a lot of people, right? And it's made people a lot of money, but is it the best choice that we can make from a policy perspective? Maybe. So when we talk about the role of subsidies, it's one thing to sort of shield producers from risks associated with market downturns and all of that. We do a ton of that, right? But it's another thing to mandate a product, the consumption of which actually takes 25 million acres. That's an amazing choice that we made. And I don't think many people really, fully comprehend the nature of that choice. I mean, we pump water from the ground in order to burn the corn in our cars. That's a very interesting choice that we've made. We pump water from the ground in order to grow beef for people to eat, or pork, or whatever. That's a set of choices too. And especially when that product is going to an export market, that's a very nice thing for us to do for other countries as well. But there's trade, so there's all of this. But when agriculture became a fuel source in 2007, 2008, and on, I said when that Energy Act was passed, I said, this is going to be very interesting because now agriculture is an oil company. And it hasn't yet taken on that identity. It's really an amazing thing, I think, that we don't regard agriculture as an oil company, as frackers, right? But effectively, we're doing a lot of that. Now it's a renewable energy source, but the carbon benefits of it are pretty hard to pin down and all of that. So I think that when we talk about subsidies, we have to open the book pretty big and try to figure out what are the subsidies that we're doing. But all of that, I think you're right, makes agriculture profitable. And if agriculture is profitable, and I think income is still one of the main drivers of the value of agricultural land, then the increased cost of agricultural land and the rent associated with it acts as the biggest barrier, I think, to entry. All right, I've probably talked way past. Sorry, Jesse.
No, that was awesome. And quite honestly, I think the fact that there's still close to 40 people on the line is probably a testament to how engaged people are. And thanks for being, Anthony, so generous with your time and your expertise. I mean, we threw actually a lot of different topics out there during the last 90 minutes, and I thought you did a great job of just fielding them from all angles.
There's a fair amount of blasphemy in there too. I realize that, and I know that it's never that simple. There are reasonable other views on the choices that we've made. So I just want to make sure that I don't want to throw everybody under the bus by any means. But I think these are not unreasonable views of where we're at in the sector. And if they're not unreasonable views, then we at least have to deal with them. So in any event, thank you for having me. Hopefully it was a good way to kick off. I think you've got some great speakers down the road, many who can speak to more directly, I suppose, to the injustices that are part of our natural resources in Nebraska, the Great Plains.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll segue out with that. That's a great transition to the next spring seminar. So for people who are maybe new and don't know about the series, they happen every other Wednesday in the spring academic term. And so our next one puts us at the 17th of February. So it'll be at 3:30 p.m., same Zoom link as this talk. And for our next speaker, he has a wonderful name, Doug Crowghost. And Doug is the water administrator up at the Standing Rock tribe in the Dakotas. And he's going to talk a lot about indigenous concepts of water and land management and land use. And of course, he'll talk a lot about the Dakota Access pipelines and other pipelines and how they work, with tribal authorities and with the federal government and local agencies to manage all the issues that are up there. Again, you can go to watercenter.unl.edu to check that out. Just wanted to also thank the Water Center staff as I'm on the way out here for fielding some questions and then letting people into the waiting room. And thank you, everybody, for asking such good questions and staying engaged now for the 90-minute mark. So we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Take care.